The grand chandelier cast a golden glow over the palace ballroom, where laughter and music intertwined in the air like an intoxicating perfume. The elite of the Arab world, sheiks, diplomats, and heirs of empires, gathered in opulent silk robes, sipping the finest wine and reveling in their power. Among them sat Prince Rafiq al-Mansur, the youngest son of the ruling family, a man whose charm was rivaled only by his arrogance. "Marry her," a friend scoffed, nudging his goblet toward the marketplace below, where a hunched candy seller wrapped her brittle sweets in old parchment. The woman's face was weathered, her features sharp and unremarkable, far from the ethereal beauty expected in the prince's world. Rafiq smirked. "A prince marrying a commoner? Absurd. Scared you'll lose?" another friend taunted. The words clawed at his pride. And so, with a flippant laugh and a reckless nod, Prince Rafiq sealed his fate. But on their wedding night, as the palace doors shut behind them, he discovered a truth so shocking, so unfathomable, that his entire world collapsed beneath him. Hey everyone! Welcome back to Ever After Stories. Today, I have a heartfelt story to share with you. Get ready to feel all the emotions. Prince Rafiq was a man of indulgence. At 27, he had never known hardship, never tasted regret. He was the youngest prince of the Al-Mansur dynasty, born into untold wealth and an effortless life where desires were met before they were spoken. His name alone sent whispers through royal courts. His charm could disarm even the most reserved of aristocrats. But he was also a man who did not like to be challenged. The night of the bet had started like any other, lavish, intoxicating, and filled with reckless amusement. A group of noblemen, his closest confidants, had spent the evening wagering absurd dares, each more ridiculous than the last. And then came the ultimate challenge, marrying the least desirable woman they could find. Rafiq had scoffed at first. "What do I gain from this?" "Prove you have the power to turn even a beggar into royalty," his friend Fahad sneered. "Or admit that without wealth, you are nothing." The words struck deep. Rafiq was not one to back down. So, with an arrogant grin and a heart full of misplaced confidence, he had a servant summon the candy seller to the palace gates. Her name was Amira. She arrived wrapped in tattered linen, her hands stained from years of labor, her face bearing the weight of a life lived in survival. She did not bow or tremble before the prince. Instead, she met his gaze with something unexpected: indifference. "You summoned me, Your Highness?" she asked, voice steady. "I wish to marry you," Rafiq declared, expecting shock, gratitude, or at the very least, confusion. Instead, Amira gave a small, knowing smile. "Then you should know, Your Highness, that wagers have consequences." The words unsettled him, but the night was too intoxicating, the laughter of his friends too loud. He ignored the warning. The wedding was held in haste. No extravagant celebration, no grand feast, only a simple ceremony that sent whispers through the kingdom. A prince marrying a commoner? A woman of no beauty, no status? The royal court was scandalized. But Rafiq didn't care. It was all a game he had won. Until their wedding night. As he stepped into their chambers, expecting meek obedience, perhaps even gratitude, Amira turned to him with calm certainty and uttered the words that would change everything. "Tell me, Your Highness, do you believe in fate?" For the first time in his life, Prince Rafiq felt unnerved. The air in the chamber was heavy with the scent of burning oud, its musky fragrance swirling between the silk-draped walls. The golden lanterns cast flickering shadows, painting the illusion of movement in the stillness. Amira stood before him, not timid, not overwhelmed, but composed. She had changed from her tattered marketplace garb into the simple yet elegant silk robe provided by the palace maids. But no silk could hide the truth. She was no beauty by the standards of the court. Her features were sharp, her skin sun-worn, her hands rough with years of toil. Yet it wasn't her appearance that unsettled Rafiq, it was her presence. He had expected nervousness, perhaps gratitude, even the quiet weeping of a woman unworthy of such an impossible fate. Instead, she studied him with an expression unreadable, neither awed nor afraid. "Do you believe in fate, Your Highness?" she repeated. Rafiq smirked, masking the unease creeping into his bones. I believe in choice. And tonight, I chose to change your life." A smile ghosted over her lips, but there was something about it, something knowing. "Then you should be prepared for what comes next." Before he could respond, Amira stepped forward, her hands moving with surprising grace. She reached for a golden decanter on the table, pouring 2 cups of saffron-infused tea. Rafiq raised an eyebrow. "You would serve me in my own palace?" "In my world, it is custom for a wife to serve her husband on their wedding night." She extended the cup toward him. "Drink, Your Highness." He hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking it. The warmth seeped into his fingers as he brought the rim to his lips. The tea was rich, spiced, familiar, yet somehow different. A strange sensation trickled down his throat, a quiet heat spreading in his chest. Amira watched him closely. "You seem so certain of yourself," he remarked, lowering the cup. "Most women would be trembling in my presence, grateful for the life I've handed them." Amira tilted her head, the faintest trace of amusement in her eyes. "Most women have not lived my life." Something in her tone made his grip tighten on the cup. He had married this woman on a reckless bet, convinced that she was nothing, a nameless figure in the marketplace, forgotten before sunset. And yet, as he looked at her now, he realized a chilling truth. He knew nothing about Amira, but she knew something about him. And by the time the night was over, his entire world would never be the same. The silence between them stretched, thick and charged, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Rafiq had always been the master of the room, the one who dictated the flow of conversation, the one whose presence alone could command submission. But here, in his own chamber, before a woman he had barely regarded as human just hours ago, he felt something foreign, something dangerously close to uncertainty. Amira took a slow sip of her tea, her movements deliberate, unhurried. It was as if she were waiting for something. Rafiq set his cup down with a quiet clink, narrowing his eyes. "You don't seem surprised by any of this." She met his gaze. "Should I be? You were a candy seller this morning," he pointed out. "And now you are a princess of the Al-Mansur dynasty?" She smiled, but there was no joy in it. "And you were a prince this morning," she murmured. "Yet tonight, you are a man who made a choice he does not understand." A strange chill slithered down Rafiq's spine. There was something in her voice, something layered, something deeper than mere words. He had expected tears, expected gratitude, even resentment. What he had not expected was this eerie sense that Amira had walked into his life already knowing how the story would unfold. His patience thinned. "Enough riddles," he said. "Who are you?" Amira set her cup down. "My name is Amira bint Jal," she said evenly. "Daughter of a merchant. Sister to no one. Wife to a prince." Her words were simple, yet they held weight. A weight he could not place. "I see," Rafiq said, leaning back in his chair, masking his unease with arrogance. "Then tell me, Amira bint Jal, why were you selling candy in the streets?" Amira's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Because that is where you found me." A slow, careful answer. "Too careful." Rafiq frowned. "And before that?" She exhaled softly, as if deciding how much to reveal. "Before that, I was living a life that no longer exists." Something about the way she said it, so final, so certain, sent a whisper of unease through him. He watched her, searching for a crack in her composure, some sign of deception. But she sat before him, calm, poised, and utterly unreadable. And for the first time in his life, Prince Rafiq found himself at a loss. This woman, this so-called nobody, was hiding something. And whatever it was going to change everything. The golden lanterns flickered as a draft whispered through the chamber, stirring the silk curtains like ghostly fingers. Rafiq sat motionless, his sharp eyes never leaving Amira. The game, if it had ever been a game, was shifting, and he was no longer certain he was the one in control. He had married her for amusement, a reckless bet made in arrogance. But now, sitting across from her in the dimly lit chamber, he felt something unfamiliar gnawing at him. "Doubt your life no longer exists?" Rafiq repeated, his voice quieter this time. Amira's fingers traced the rim of her cup, lost in thought. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, as if making a decision, she leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Your Highness," she said, "do you know the story of Jal al-Badawi?" The name sent a ripple through Rafiq's memory. It was familiar, distant but not forgotten. He frowned, sifting through the layers of his mind. Jal al-Badawi. A merchant. No, not just a merchant, a powerful one. A man whose wealth had once rivaled the lesser emirs. A man who had mysteriously disappeared years ago, along with his entire family. His blood ran cold. "You are his daughter?" Rafiq asked slowly. Amira nodded once. Rafiq leaned back, his mind racing. "But that is impossible. The Badawi family was—" He stopped himself. Erased. That was the word. 5 years ago, Jal al-Badawi had fallen out of favor with the ruling elite. His wealth had been seized, his allies had vanished, and soon after, whispers spread that his family had perished. It was said that no one had survived. Yet here she was, sitting before him. Alive. How? Rafiq demanded. "How are you still here?" Amira met his gaze, and for the first time that night, he saw something flicker in her eyes. A shadow of pain, quickly masked. "My father was betrayed," she said quietly. "He trusted the wrong people. When they came for him, he told me to run." Rafiq exhaled, trying to process this revelation. The daughter of a fallen merchant, thought to be dead, now sitting as his wife in the royal palace. 1,000 questions pressed against his mind, but one stood above all. "Why were you selling candy in the streets?" he asked. "If you were hiding, why not leave the city?" Amira's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. "Because sometimes," she murmured, "the safest place to hide is in plain sight." Rafiq's mind spun. He had married her on a reckless bet, thinking she was nothing. But she was not nothing. She was a secret that could destroy them both. And for the first time since the bet began, Prince Rafiq realized he might have made a terrible mistake. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls had drawn closer, suffocating the space between them. Rafiq leaned forward, his hands clasped together, his mind racing through every possibility. Jal al-Badawi. A name once spoken with reverence in the merchant courts. A man whose influence had stretched beyond trade routes, whose fortune had threatened the balance of power. Then, overnight, he had vanished, erased, as if he had never existed. The official story was simple: treason. Deals made in secret, alliances forged in the shadows. But no one had ever known the full truth. And now, his daughter sat before him, alive. "You shouldn't be here," Rafiq said finally, his voice low. Amira tilted her head. "And yet, here I am." Her calmness unnerved him. Most people would cower, would shrink under the weight of such a revelation. But she sat with the quiet poise of someone who had nothing left to fear. "You don't understand what you've done," Rafiq pressed. "Marrying me puts you under the full scrutiny of the court. If anyone recognizes you—" "They won't," she interrupted. "The girl they knew is gone. The woman before you is no one." "No one." Rafiq studied her. The confident, sharp-witted woman sitting before him was not the helpless beggar he had imagined when he made the bet. She had survived something few could, and she had done so with strategy, with patience. And yet, something still did not make sense. "Why did you agree to marry me?" he asked. "You could have refused." Her lips curled slightly. "And if I had?" Rafiq faltered. Truth be told, he had not expected her to agree. He had assumed she would protest, or cry, or attempt to flee, anything but stand before him as though she had already decided her fate long before he had spoken the words. "It was a bet," he admitted. "A foolish one. You could have said no." Amira's gaze darkened. "Could I?" she murmured. "A prince commands a commoner to his palace, offers her a life in luxury, and she dares to refuse?" The weight of her words settled over him. No, she had not truly had a choice. Not in the way he had imagined. And yet, there was something else. Something she was not saying. "What do you want?" Rafiq asked. Amira's fingers traced the rim of her cup again, a quiet habit. "You assume I want something?" "Everyone wants something," he countered. She exhaled softly, then met his gaze. "Then tell me, Your Highness, what do you want?" The question caught him off guard. He had spent his life never needing to answer it. Wealth, power, indulgence, everything had been handed to him before he could even form a desire for it. And now, before this woman who should have meant nothing, he found himself at a loss. What did he want? What had he ever wanted? A long silence stretched between them before Amira finally spoke again, her voice quiet, measured. "You may think you won a bet tonight, Prince Rafik," she murmured. "But fate does not play games. You made a choice." She leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes locked onto his. "And now you must live with it?" Rafik swallowed. For the first time since this night began, he was no longer sure who had truly won. The air in the chamber was thick with unspoken words, each one heavier than the last. Prince Rafik had entered this night believing he was in control, that he was the one who dictated the course of events. But now, as he sat across from Amira, her presence unraveling everything he thought he knew, he could feel the ground shifting beneath him. He had married a ghost, a woman who should not exist. "Does anyone else know you are alive?" he asked, his voice quieter now, more measured. Amira shook her head. "No one who matters." Rafik exhaled slowly. He wanted to believe her, but there was something in her tone, something too careful. A woman who had spent 5 years surviving would not simply walk into the hands of the royal family without reason. "You chose this," he said, watching her closely. "You knew who I was, knew what this marriage would mean. Why? What are you after?" Amira's lips parted slightly, but she did not answer right away. Instead, she studied him, as if deciding just how much truth to give. Then she spoke. "5 years ago, my father was betrayed," she said. "By someone he trusted." Rafik felt a slow chill creep through his veins. "Who?" he asked. She hesitated, then shook her head. "Not yet." His patience thinned. "Not yet. I am still deciding whether I can trust you, Your Highness." The words sent a ripple of something unfamiliar through him. Annoyance. Intrigue. Perhaps even admiration. She had nothing, no power, no allies, no standing. And yet she spoke to him, the prince of the Al-Mansur dynasty, as though they were equals. As though she was testing him just as much as he was testing her. "Trust is earned, not given," she continued. "And so far, all I know of you is that you made a bet with your friends and now you are stuck with a wife you did not want." Rafik clenched his jaw. She was right, but he was also right. Amira was hiding something. And whether she was friend or enemy, he needed to find out what. For the first time that night, he truly studied her. Not just as the candy seller he had married on impulse, not just as a mystery to unravel, but as a person. She was not fragile, nor was she foolish. Every word she spoke was careful, every move measured. She was waiting for something. For him to act? For him to fall into a trap? Or for him to prove he was different from the men who had destroyed her family? He didn't know. But one thing was clear, this was no ordinary woman. And whatever her past was, it was far from over. Rafik leaned back, his gaze unwavering. "Then tell me, Amira," he said, his voice quieter now, more controlled. "What happens next?" Amira's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "That," she murmured, "depends on you." The golden lanterns flickered as the night stretched deeper, the silence between them taut with unspoken tension. Rafik had never felt uneasy in his own palace before, but something about Amira's presence unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. She was a puzzle, a contradiction, someone who should have been broken by the weight of her past, yet sat before him whole, unyielding, and unreadable. And now, she had placed the next move in his hands. "What happens next depends on me?" Rafik repeated, studying her carefully. "You speak as though I have a choice." Amira exhaled softly. "There is always a choice, Your Highness." Rafik smirked, though there was no amusement behind it. A bold claim from someone whose fate was decided by a drunken bet? Something flickered in Amira's eyes, something sharp. "And yet," she said, "you are the one asking me what happens next." Rafik clenched his jaw. She had a way of twisting words, of turning his own questions back onto him. It was a skill, one he recognized. She was no mere street vendor. She had been raised in power, trained to navigate conversations like a battlefield. Just like the nobles in his court. just like a woman who once belonged to a family of influence. "You are dangerous," he muttered before he could stop himself. Amira's lips curled slightly. "I have only told you the truth." But truth, Rafik knew, was often the most dangerous thing of all. He exhaled, trying to regain control of the conversation. "You say your father was betrayed. By whom?" Again she hesitated, that same flicker of calculation in her gaze. Then she spoke. "Your father's counsel," she said. Rafik stilled. The revelation sent a slow, creeping cold through his veins. His father's counsel, the advisors who had shaped the empire, the men who had stood at the king's side for decades. The men who had been whispering in his father's ear long before Rafik had been old enough to understand the weight of their influence. One of them had destroyed Amira's family. "You have proof?" he asked, his voice quiet but edged. "No," she admitted. "Not yet." Rafik inhaled sharply, his mind racing. If what she said was true, then this was bigger than a mere act of revenge. It meant that there were forces within his father's court who were willing to erase an entire family for power. And now, those same forces would be watching him. Because of her. His mistake had been thinking this marriage was nothing more than a reckless game. His mistake had been underestimating the woman sitting across from him. He leaned forward, his voice low. "Do you realize the risk you have taken by coming here?" Amira held his gaze. "Do you?" The words settled between them like a final move in a game neither had realized they were playing. For better or worse, their fates were now intertwined. And if they weren't careful, it would destroy them both. The night deepened, cloaking the palace in a hushed stillness. Outside, the wind whispered through the courtyards, carrying the distant murmur of palace guards changing shifts. Inside Rafik's chamber, the tension remained thick, a silent storm brewing between him and the woman who had just upended his world. He had always believed himself untouchable. A prince. A man of privilege, bound by duty but never by fear. Yet tonight, for the first time, he felt the weight of something he had never expected, uncertainty. Amira had pulled him into something far bigger than he had anticipated. What had begun as an arrogant bet was now a thread tangled in the dangerous web of royal power, a web where betrayal and ambition lurked in the shadows. If her story was true, then his father's most trusted advisors had blood on their hands. And if they discovered that Amira was alive? Rafik exhaled sharply, his mind racing. "If you don't have proof, then what do you have?" Amira tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Memories. Whispers. Names spoken in hushed voices before my father's downfall." "That isn't enough," he muttered. "Not yet," she admitted. Rafik frowned, drumming his fingers against the armrest of his chair. He was no fool. Accusing his father's counsel of treachery without evidence was as good as signing his own death warrant. The court was a nest of vipers, and they had spent years perfecting the art of eliminating threats before they could rise. If Amira was right, then she was already a marked woman. And now, by marrying her, so was he. His throat tightened. He had played this game for sport, a fleeting moment of amusement. But now, amusement had turned into a noose tightening around his neck. He needed to make a decision. "Why did you really agree to this marriage?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Amira was silent for a long moment. Then, with careful deliberation, she said, "Because I knew one day I would need an ally." Rafik's pulse quickened. Ally. Not a husband. Not a prince. An ally. She had never intended to be his wife in the traditional sense. She had agreed to this marriage because she saw an opportunity, because she believed that he, out of everyone in the royal family, might be the only person willing to listen. The realization unsettled him. "You are playing a dangerous game," he muttered. Amira's lips curled slightly. "So are you." The words hung between them, charged with a weight neither of them could ignore. For the first time, Rafik saw the truth. This marriage was no accident. It was a collision of two fates, two lives entangled in a history of betrayal and power. And whether he wanted to or not, he was now part of it. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "If we do this," he said carefully, "if we uncover the truth, there is no turning back." Amira's dark eyes burned with quiet determination. "There was never a way back," she whispered. A cold certainty settled in Rafiq's chest. They were no longer prince and wife. They were conspirators. And if they weren't careful, they would become the next ones erased from history. The moon hung low over the palace, its silver glow stretching long shadows across the marble floors. Somewhere in the distance, the faint strains of a lute drifted from the servant quarters, a melancholic tune lost in the vastness of the royal estate. Inside Rafiq's chamber, silence reigned. Amira sat poised, her back straight, her gaze unwavering as she studied the man who was now both her husband and her only chance at justice. Rafiq, for his part, had not spoken for several minutes. He sat with his hands steepled beneath his chin, his thoughts a storm Amira could see swirling behind his dark eyes. She had given him a choice. She had revealed enough to show him the dangers ahead, but not everything. Not yet, she needed him to decide first. Rafiq finally exhaled, rubbing his temples. "You understand what you're asking of me?" he murmured. Amira tilted her head slightly. "I'm not asking for anything. I am telling you the truth. What you do with it is your choice." A muscle in his jaw tightened. "You want an ally, but what you truly need is protection." He leaned forward. "If the council learns you are alive—" "They will not," Amira interjected. "Not unless you tell them." Rafiq frowned. "You think I would betray you?" "I think you don't yet know where you stand," Amira said simply. "A prince's duty is to the kingdom, to the stability of his father's rule. If I become a threat to that stability, will you still protect me?" Rafiq inhaled deeply. He had spent his life at court, surrounded by power plays and whispered betrayals, but this was different. This was personal. This was his wife, a woman who had survived against all odds, who had more to lose than he did. And yet, despite everything, she had placed herself in his hands. He didn't know if he admired her for it, or feared what she might be capable of. Rafiq straightened, his voice firm. "You need proof," he said. "And if the council is as powerful as you say, then they will have buried every trace of their betrayal." Amira nodded. "Which means we need to uncover what they missed." Rafiq narrowed his eyes. "And where do we start?" She hesitated for the first time that night. Then, after a moment, she spoke. "There is one man who may know the truth." Rafiq stilled. "Who?" Amira took a slow breath. "My father's former advisor," she said. "The only one who tried to warn him before it was too late." Rafiq frowned. "If he is still alive, why has he not come forward?" "Because he fled," Amira said. "After my father's downfall, he disappeared into exile. I do not know where he is now, but I know he holds the answers we seek." Rafiq drummed his fingers against the table. "Then we need to find him." A beat of silence passed. Amira met his gaze. "And when we do?" Rafiq hesitated for only a moment before replying. "We make our first move." A slow, knowing look passed between them. The bet that had begun as a reckless game had transformed into something far greater. The first strike was coming, and it would change everything. The desert wind howled through the palace corridors as Rafiq stood on his balcony, staring into the endless night. The weight of his decision pressed down on him, heavier than the golden rings that adorned his fingers, heavier than the title he had worn all his life. A bet. That was all it had been. A drunken challenge. And yet, now, he was standing at the precipice of something far greater than he had ever anticipated. Behind him, Amira stepped forward. Though she moved silently, he could sense her presence, the quiet intensity that had drawn him into her storm. "You're certain about this?" he asked without turning. "I am," she said simply. Rafiq exhaled. "Then we begin." Finding a man lost to exile was no small task, especially when the search had to remain hidden from the very people who ruled the kingdom. Rafiq knew that if the council discovered their intentions, it would not be whispers and warnings that followed, it would be death. "We start with the merchants," Rafiq said, pacing in his chamber. "If he is alive, he must have found a way to sustain himself. A man of power does not easily become a beggar." Amira nodded. "He had friends once, allies in the court before they turned their backs on my father. There may be one or two who still hold loyalty in secret." Rafiq smirked wryly. "Loyalty is a dangerous thing in these halls. If they have survived this long, they have learned to hide it well." Still, it was their only lead. With careful precision, Rafik sent word to his most trusted servant, a man named Omar, who had served the palace for years but owed his true allegiance to Rafik alone. Find whispers of Jibrin al-Fidel, he instructed. Do not ask outright. Do not be seen. Simply listen. Omar, ever the quiet shadow, nodded once and vanished into the night. Now all they could do was wait. Waiting, however, came with its own dangers. 2 days after their secret search began, Rafik was summoned to the council chambers. It was an unusual request. Though he was a prince, his role in court matters had always been secondary, his father's advisors ensuring that he was groomed to rule but never to challenge their control. As he stepped into the grand hall, he felt their eyes on him. Men dressed in rich silks, their faces weathered with age and power. These were the men who had shaped the kingdom, the men who had decided the fate of countless others, including, perhaps, Amira's father. Your Highness, Grand Vizier Malik greeted him, his voice smooth, unreadable. It has come to our attention that you have been occupied with certain matters. Rafik kept his expression neutral. I was unaware my daily activities required the council's oversight. A few of the older men exchanged glances. Malik merely smiled. Of course not. But as your father's trusted advisors, we must ensure that all matters concerning the royal family remain secure. There was the unspoken warning. They were watching him. They had noticed something. Rafik forced a small chuckle, feigning ease. If this is about my recent marriage, I assure you, it was nothing more than an unfortunate wager. Ah yes, Malik mused. A peculiar choice indeed. A candy seller from the market. Most would not have expected such a match. Rafik's fingers curled slightly. He could hear the curiosity laced beneath the words, the careful probing. They were trying to determine if there was more to his marriage than mere foolishness. He could not let them see the truth. A match I must now live with, he said with a resigned sigh. She is harmless, I assure you. Though I do regret the lack of an annulment clause in my wager. The men chuckled, the tension in the room easing. Rafik knew the game well. Sometimes, the best deception was to let them believe he was still the careless prince they thought him to be. For now, it had worked. But as he left the chamber, he knew one thing for certain. The council was already suspicious. And if they discovered Amira's true identity, the reckoning would not wait. That night, as Rafik returned to his chamber, he found Omar waiting for him. The man's usual calm demeanor was tinged with something rare, urgency. My prince, Omar said in a hushed voice. I have found something. Rafik closed the door, his pulse quickening. Go on. There is an old healer living in the outskirts of the city, Omar explained. He is known to take in lost men, those who flee from the eyes of the kingdom. I overheard a merchant mention a man who once claimed to be part of the royal court. Rafik's heartbeat thundered in his ears. Jibrin, where is this healer? He asked. Omar hesitated. In the slums beyond the city gates. It is not a place fit for a prince. Rafik exhaled. Then I will not go as a prince. Omar frowned, but nodded. I will prepare a disguise. As the servant left, Rafik turned toward the balcony, where Amira stood, listening. You heard? He asked. She nodded. We leave tonight? There was no hesitation, no fear, only purpose. And as Rafik looked at her, this woman who had been a mystery, a challenge, and now an ally, he realized something. She was not the only one seeking justice anymore. This was no longer just Amira's fight. It was his. The slums were a world away from the golden palaces of the kingdom. The air smelled of sweat, firewood, and desperation. Rafik walked with his hood drawn low, Amira beside him, their steps quiet on the dusty road. Omar had given them directions, and soon they found the healer's small, crumbling house at the edge of the settlement. Rafik knocked once. A long silence. Then a voice. Who seeks healing at this hour? Rafik glanced at Amira, then back at the door. A son of the kingdom, he said carefully. Looking for a man who remembers the past. Another pause. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. An old man stood before them, his face worn by years of hardship. His eyes flickered between them, recognition dawning as they landed on Amira. He inhaled sharply. By the heavens! Amira's breath caught. You know me. The man swallowed hard. I knew your father. Rafik stepped forward. Then you know why we are here. The old man's gaze darkened. Yes, he murmured. And if you have come seeking the truth, you must be ready. Ready for what? Amira asked. The old man exhaled. For the war that follows. Rafik felt the weight of the words settle over them. The reckoning had begun. And there was no turning back. The truth had been found. Now it had to be used. Rafik and Amira had risked everything to track down Jibrin al-Fadel, the exiled advisor who held the key to uncovering the corruption that had plagued the kingdom for years. But knowing the truth and proving it were two very different things. The council was powerful. They controlled the palace, the guards, and the very laws that dictated the kingdom. If they suspected a rebellion, they would strike first. Time was running out. The reckoning had begun. Jibrin al-Fadel closed the door behind them, his hands trembling as he bolted it shut. The dim candlelight flickered across his worn face, his eyes darting between Rafik and Amira as if he were seeing ghosts. For years, I prayed that someone would come, he murmured, sinking onto a wooden bench. I feared the truth would die with me. Amira stepped forward, her voice steady. Then tell us everything. Jibrin's gaze softened as he looked at her. You are your father's daughter. He inhaled sharply, gathering his thoughts. Your father, Sultan Harun, was betrayed by his closest men. The council feared his reforms, his vision of a kingdom where power was not hoarded by the elite but shared with the people. Rafik frowned. They orchestrated his downfall? Jibrin nodded. They created false accusations, fabricated evidence of treason, and turned the palace guards against him. Before he could defend himself, they struck. Amira's hands curled into fists. And my mother? Jibrin looked away. She was meant to die alongside him. But she fled into the desert, carrying you. I do not know what became of her. A heavy silence filled the room. Rafik finally spoke. If we expose them, if we bring proof before my father, the council will fall. Jibrin's expression darkened. The Sultan is surrounded by those same men. They have spent years tightening their grip on him. If you wish to succeed, you must not simply expose them. He looked directly at Rafik. You must replace them. Rafik exhaled slowly. He had always played the game of power from the sidelines, a prince with little interest in politics. But now the game had come for him. He turned to Amir. Are you ready for this? Her eyes burned with quiet fury. I have been ready my entire life. The palace walls had never felt so suffocating. Rafik walked through the grand halls with measured steps, his face composed, his mind racing. The conversation with Jibrin al-Fadel had changed everything. This was no longer a matter of curiosity or justice. It was war. The council had betrayed a sultan once. They would not hesitate to do so again. He had to move carefully. Amira was waiting for him in the shadows of his private chambers. When he entered, she did not speak. She only searched his face for answers. They know I'm watching, he said quietly, shutting the door behind him. Malik and the others, when they summoned me to the council, it was a warning. Amira frowned. They suspect you? They suspect something. He exhaled. But they do not know about Jibrin. Amira's shoulders relaxed slightly. That gives us an advantage. Rafik nodded. But not for long. They needed proof, something undeniable. Jibrin's testimony alone would not be enough. The council had spent years erasing their crimes. If they were going to bring them down, they needed more than words. Amira's voice was steady. Then we take it from them. Rafik turned to her. What are you suggesting? She stepped closer. The council keeps records, does it not? Letters, ledgers, secret correspondences? Yes, Rafik admitted. But they are locked away in the royal archives, deep beneath the palace. Only the Grand Vizier and a few trusted scribes have access. Amira's lips curved into a determined smile. Then we find a way in. Rafik hesitated. That would mean breaking into one of the most secure rooms in the palace. Amira met his gaze. I spent years surviving on the streets, slipping past guards who would have had me executed if they knew who I was. Breaking into a room of scrolls will not be the most difficult thing I have done. Rafik couldn't help but smile. "You are not the woman I expected when I made that foolish bet." Amira raised an eyebrow. "And are you disappointed?" Rafik studied her for a moment before shaking his head. "Not in the slightest." For the first time since this all began, he felt something unfamiliar. Not duty, not pressure, hope. The archives were buried deep within the palace's foundation, guarded by heavy doors and men who took their loyalty to the grave. No one entered without written permission from the Grand Vizier himself, which meant Rafik and Amira would have to get creative. The plan was simple. Rafik, using his status as a prince, would create a distraction, summoning the head archivist under false pretenses, drawing attention away from the entrance. Amira, disguised as a palace servant, would slip inside, locate the records, and retrieve anything that tied the council to Sultan Harun's downfall. It had to be fast. It had to be flawless. Failure meant death. The palace was silent at midnight, its grandeur cast in long shadows beneath the moonlight. Most of the royal court had retired for the night, leaving only the ever-watchful guards and a handful of servants tending to their nightly duties. It was the perfect time to strike. Rafik adjusted the silk sash around his waist as he strode down the hallway toward the archives. His posture was relaxed, his expression composed, but his mind was sharp, calculating every movement. His part in the plan was simple: create a distraction. As he reached the entrance to the archives, two guards straightened, gripping their spears. They were well-trained, disciplined, loyal to the Grand Vizier. That was the real obstacle. Rafik gave them a nod of acknowledgement before turning his gaze to the scribe standing just beyond the doorway. "Summon the head archivist," he said in a voice of authority. "I require immediate access to the royal records." The scribe blinked in surprise. "Your Highness, at this hour?" "Yes," Rafik's tone was final. "Shall I summon my father to explain why his son is being denied?" The guards exchanged a glance. That was enough. One of them nodded to the scribe, who quickly disappeared into the depths of the archives to fetch the head archivist. Rafik exhaled slowly. That would buy them a few minutes. Now it was up to Amira. Dressed in the simple robes of a palace servant, Amira moved with the grace of someone who belonged. She carried a stack of old parchments, her head bowed slightly, her movements purposeful but unremarkable. No one noticed the servants. It was a rule she had learned long ago. Those who cleaned, cooked, and carried were invisible to those who ruled. As Rafik held the guard's attention, Amira slipped into the darkened hall beyond the entrance. The air was thick with the scent of parchment and ink, the soft flicker of lanterns casting a golden glow over the countless shelves of scrolls and ledgers. She didn't have much time. Moving quickly, she scanned the rows, searching for any records from the reign of Sultan Harun. Her fingers traced over old tomes and wax-sealed letters, her heart pounding in her chest. Then she found it. A leather-bound ledger, its edges worn with age. It bore the royal seal, but more importantly, it held something even more valuable: Malik's personal insignia. The Grand Vizier's own records. She pulled it free and flipped through the pages. What she saw made her breath hitch. Detailed accounts of bribes paid to palace guards. Secret meetings with rival noble families. Orders given to soldiers. Orders that had led to Sultan Harun's downfall. Proof, undeniable, indisputable proof. A sound from the hallway made her freeze. Footsteps. The archivist was returning. Amira knew she had seconds to act. She pulled a small blade from her sleeve and sliced out the most damning pages, rolling them into a tight bundle before tucking them into her robes. Then, swiftly, she replaced the book and slipped behind a tall shelf, her body pressed against the cool stone wall. She could hear voices now. The archivist, confused. Rafik, calm and collected. The guards, growing impatient. She needed to get out, now. Carefully, she retraced her steps, moving like a shadow until she reached the doorway. The guards were still focused on Rafik. With one deep breath, she stepped forward, blending into a group of servants passing by. She didn't look back. By the time Rafik ended his distraction and turned to leave, she was already gone. Amira moved swiftly through the palace corridors, her heart pounding against her ribs. The stolen pages pressed against her skin, hidden within the folds of her robes. Every shadow felt like a threat, every passing guard a potential enemy. She forced herself to breathe, to walk as though she belonged. The weight of what she had just stolen felt heavy, not just in her hands but in her soul. This wasn't just proof, it was a weapon. A weapon that could shatter the council's control, expose their crimes, and change the fate of the kingdom. But only if they used it wisely. She reached Rafiq's chambers without being stopped, slipping inside unnoticed. Moments later, the prince arrived, closing the door behind him. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp as he studied her. "Well?" he asked. In response, Amira pulled the crumpled pages from her robes and laid them on the table between them. "We have it." Rafiq's fingers tightened as he reached for the parchment. He scanned the words quickly, his breath catching at the names, the dates, the undeniable proof of treachery. "They ordered the guards to turn against Sultan Harun," he murmured, his jaw tightening. "They bribed key commanders, fabricated treason charges, and ensured his execution before he could defend himself." Amira nodded. "There's more." Malik met with rival noble houses, ones who stood to gain from the Sultan's fall. He promised them power in exchange for their silence. Rafiq clenched his fists. "My father has been blind to the men who control his throne." He exhaled sharply. "But we can open his eyes." Amira hesitated. "If we go to him now, Malik will strike first. He has too much to lose." Rafiq met her gaze. "Then we must strike first." They sat in the dim candlelight, poring over the stolen documents, weighing their options. The council was powerful, but power meant nothing if the people turned against them. Amira's mind raced. "We need allies. Others who despise the council's rule but are too afraid to act alone." Rafiq nodded. "My father still holds influence, even if Malik controls the court. If we can show him the truth, he might be able to strip the council of their power. But we cannot trust the palace guards," Amira reminded him. "Too many of them are already bought." A knock at the door made them both freeze. Rafiq rose cautiously, pressing his ear against the wood. "Who is it?" A familiar voice answered. "It is I, Gibran." Rafiq exhaled and unlatched the door. The old advisor stepped inside, his face grim. "We have a problem." Amira stiffened. "What kind of problem?" Gibran's eyes darkened. "Malik knows something was taken from the archives. The council is already searching for the thief." Rafiq exchanged a glance with Amira. "Then we must act now." Gibran nodded. "Time is against us. But if you wish to reclaim the throne that was stolen, you must be ready for war." The kingdom was on the verge of a storm. Word spread like wildfire through the palace. Something had been stolen from the archives. The council had tightened security, doubling the guards and questioning the scribes. No one knew what had been taken, but the fear in their voices was enough to confirm that Malik suspected the worst. Rafiq, Amira, and Gibran had no choice but to move quickly. Seated in Rafiq's chambers, the three of them pored over their next move. The stolen documents lay between them like a weapon waiting to be unsheathed. "We cannot keep this hidden for long," Gibran murmured. "Malik's influence runs deep. If he suspects you, he will act before you have a chance to strike." Amira's jaw tightened. "Then we expose him first?" Rafiq nodded. "But we need the right audience. If we bring this directly to my father, Malik will twist the truth before he even reads it." Gibran stroked his beard, deep in thought. "Then we bring it to the people?" Amira's eyes widened. "The people?" Gibran leaned forward. "The council thrives on secrecy. They operate in the shadows, whispering into the sultan's ear. But if the people see the truth, if they know their rightful sultan was betrayed, they will rise against the council." Rafiq considered this. "But how do we reach them?" Gibran's eyes flickered with something dangerous. "I know a way." Deep in the heart of the city, beyond the palace walls, there were those who despised the council just as much as Rafiq and Amira did. They were the merchants crushed under unfair taxes, the scholars silenced for questioning authority, the warriors cast aside for refusing to bend the knee to corrupt men. They were the forgotten, and they were waiting for a leader. Gibran led Rafiq and Amira through the winding alleyways of the city, moving swiftly under the cover of darkness. The scent of spice and burning oil filled the air, the streets alive even at this late hour. But where they were going, the light did not reach. Finally, they arrived at an old stone building, its doors guarded by two men with sharp eyes and concealed blades. At the sight of Jibrin, the men stepped aside without a word. Inside, a group of figures sat around a worn wooden table, their faces hardened by struggle. They were not nobles. They were not men of wealth. They were rebels. An older man with a scarred cheek stood as they entered. "Jibrin," he said, voice rough as gravel. "You bring unexpected guests?" Jibrin gestured to Rafik. "This is Prince Rafik bin Khalid." A murmur rippled through the room. The scarred man's eyes narrowed. "A prince?" "Here, I am not here as a prince," Rafik said firmly. "I am here as someone who wants to see justice done." The room fell silent. Then Amira stepped forward, her voice steady. "We have proof that the council betrayed Sultan Harun. Proof that they have ruled from the shadows for years, controlling the kingdom as they see fit." She placed the stolen documents on the table. "And we intend to expose them." The scarred man studied the pages carefully, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up. "If what you say is true, then you will have more than just our ears." Rafik met his gaze. "We will need more than ears. We will need an army." A slow smile spread across the man's face. "Then it is war." The council moved faster than expected. By dawn, the palace was in lockdown. Guards patrolled the halls in pairs, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. Servants whispered of secret meetings, of Malik and his closest allies summoning commanders behind closed doors. Something was coming. Rafik watched from the balcony of his chambers, his fingers gripping the stone railing. The stolen documents had given them an edge, but an edge was not a victory. Malik was not a fool. He knew something had slipped through his fingers, and he would not rest until he crushed whoever was responsible. Amira stood beside him. "They are looking for the thief," she said. "And soon they will look for you." Rafik nodded. "Then we need to move before they do." Jibrin entered the room, his face grim. "Malik has summoned the Sultan to the council chamber. Whatever happens next, it will be decided there." Rafik turned to him. "Then we make sure my father hears the truth." Jibrin hesitated. "You mean to present the documents yourself?" "Yes, that is dangerous," Amira warned. "Malik will not let you speak freely." Rafik met her gaze. "Then we make sure he does not have a choice." The council chamber was a place of power, a grand hall lined with towering columns and banners bearing the crest of the kingdom. At its center sat Sultan Khalid, his robes heavy with gold, his expression weary from years of rule. Around him, the council members stood in their ceremonial garments, Malik at their head. Rafik entered, his steps measured, his heartbeat steady. The weight of history pressed down on him. The moment he stepped forward, Malik's cold voice echoed through the chamber. "Your Highness," he said smoothly. "You were not summoned." Rafik met his gaze without flinching. "And yet I am here." The Sultan leaned forward. "Why have you come, my son?" Rafik pulled the stolen pages from his robe and held them high. "Because the truth has been hidden from you for too long." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Malik's eyes darkened. "This is highly irregular." Rafik ignored him and turned to his father. "For years, you have been surrounded by men who claim to serve you. Men who whisper in the shadows, shaping the kingdom as they see fit. But what if I told you they were the very men who betrayed Sultan Harun?" The Sultan's expression hardened. "That is a bold accusation." Rafik took a step forward. "And I have proof." He unrolled the pages and began to read. "Here are the names of the commanders who were bribed. Here are the letters exchanged between Malik and noble families who profited from Sultan Harun's fall. Here is the evidence of treason, written in the hand of the very men who claim to be loyal to you." The room fell into stunned silence. Malik's face remained calm, but there was an edge of something else beneath his mask, danger. "My Sultan," Malik said smoothly, "these documents are forgeries. A desperate attempt to slander those who have dedicated their lives to this kingdom." Rafik turned to his father. "Then let them be examined. Let the royal scribes confirm their authenticity." The Sultan hesitated. His eyes flickered between his son and Malik. Doubt crept into his face. Rafik pressed forward. "Do you not wish to know the truth?" The Sultan opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the doors to the chamber burst open. A guard stumbled inside, blood staining his armor. "My Sultan," he gasped. "The palace is under attack." The palace erupted into chaos. The moment the guard's bloodied form collapsed onto the marble floor, the entire council chamber plunged into a frenzy. Gasps rang through the hall as the Sultan rose from his throne, his face pale with shock. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. But Rafiq already knew. Malik had made his move. The Grand Vizier's face remained impassive, but his cold eyes betrayed him. This was no mere coincidence. This was his counterattack. He had known Rafiq would bring the evidence before the Sultan, and he had prepared accordingly. A distraction. The coup. "Guards," Malik called, his voice sharp as a blade. "Secure the Sultan at once. This is an assassination attempt." The royal guards hesitated, their loyalty split between their oaths to the throne and the authority of the Grand Vizier. That hesitation was all Malik needed. From the corridor, armored men stormed into the chamber, men not dressed in the uniform of the palace guards. They bore no crest, no sigil, only blackened steel and drawn swords. Mercenaries. The council gasped as the realization set in. This was not just an internal matter. Malik had hired killers to seize the palace by force. And they were already inside. Rafiq barely had time to react before the first sword swung toward him. Instinct took over. He ducked, the blade slicing through the air where his head had been moments before. Before the mercenary could recover, Rafiq drove his elbow into the man's gut, grabbing his wrist and twisting the sword from his grasp. Amira was already moving. She snatched a dagger from her robes and lunged at another attacker, her movements precise, swift. A flick of her wrist and the man crumpled, clutching his throat. "Rafiq," Jibrin called, pulling him toward the exit. "We need to get out of here." Rafiq turned toward the Sultan. His father stood frozen in the chaos, his mind struggling to grasp the betrayal unfolding before him. "Father!" Rafiq shouted. "Come with me." But before the Sultan could move, Malik's mercenaries closed in, separating them. Malik himself stepped forward, calm amidst the violence. His eyes met Rafiq's, a slow, mocking smile spreading across his lips. "You were never meant to win this game, boy." Rafiq clenched his jaw. "This isn't over." "Indeed." Malik tilted his head. "But for you, it soon will be." Rafiq had no choice. If he stayed, he would die. Amira grabbed his wrist. "We have to go." With one last look at his father, Rafiq turned and ran. The battle spilled into the streets. As Rafiq, Amira, and Jibrin fled the palace, the sounds of clashing steel and screams filled the air. Malik's forces had planned well. The gates were already under their control, the royal guards overwhelmed. But they had not planned for the people. The rebels had been waiting. By the time Rafiq and Amira reached the marketplace, the first fires had already been lit. The people of the city, merchants, scholars, former soldiers, had seen what was happening, and they had decided to fight back. Jibrin turned to Rafiq. "This is the moment. Give the order, and they will fight for you." Rafiq's breath was heavy, his mind racing. He had spent his life as a prince in waiting, a royal with no real power. But now the people looked to him. He raised his sword high. "To the palace," he roared. "For the rightful sultan. For justice." A thunderous cry rose from the streets. The rebellion had begun. The streets of the capital burned with the fires of war. The people had risen. The city, long kept in the grip of Malik's corruption, had turned against him. The rebels, once scattered and disorganized, now fought with the fury of men and women who had nothing left to lose. Steel clashed against steel. Arrows whistled through the air, finding their marks in the bodies of Malik's mercenaries. Smoke curled into the night sky as torches were thrown against the banners of the corrupt council. The battle for the throne had begun in earnest. But Rafiq knew they had little time. If Malik managed to secure the palace, to hold the Sultan as his hostage, then the rebellion would be crushed before it had a chance to claim victory. The people would not withstand a prolonged war. The fight had to be won tonight. Rafiq turned to Amira, his breath ragged. "We need to take the palace before Malik fortifies it." She nodded, wiping blood from her dagger. "Then we go now." With Gibran and the rebel fighters at their backs, they charged toward the palace gates. The palace was no longer the grand, untouchable fortress it had once been. Malik's mercenaries had closed the gates, but they had not expected the people to fight back. As Rafiq's forces arrived, the rebels who had already reached the walls launched their attack. Arrows rained down from the rooftops, striking down Malik's men. A battering ram, hastily constructed from an old market stall, slammed into the palace doors, shaking the very foundation of the grand entrance. "Again!" Rafiq roared. The ram crashed forward, splintering the wood. Inside, the Grand Vizier stood in the Sultan's chambers, his expression cold as he listened to the distant sounds of his men losing ground. He turned to the Sultan, who was bound to his throne, his once magnificent robes now in disarray. "Do you hear that, my Sultan?" Malik said, his voice calm. "Your city is crumbling." The Sultan glared at him. "You are a fool if you think you can hold the throne with fire and steel." Malik smirked. "I do not need to hold the throne." He drew a dagger from his belt, stepping toward the Sultan. "I only need to ensure that no one else does." But before he could strike, the doors to the chamber burst open. Rafiq stood in the threshold, his sword glinting in the firelight. Malik froze. His expression shifted for the first time, not to anger, not to arrogance, but to something close to fear. "You," he hissed. Rafiq stepped forward, his voice unwavering. "Step away from the Sultan." Malik's grip tightened on his dagger. "You think you've won? That these peasants will keep you in power?" He laughed, the sound hollow. "Without men like me, this kingdom will fall to ruin." Rafiq lifted his sword. "The only thing falling tonight is you." The Grand Vizier was not a warrior, but he was a survivor. He lunged forward, striking with the speed of a man who had spent his life cutting down threats before they could grow. His dagger slashed toward Rafiq's ribs, but the prince twisted out of the way, bringing his sword down in a deadly arc. Malik barely managed to dodge, stumbling back. He reached for another weapon, a hidden blade inside his sleeve, and lashed out again. This time, the steel caught Rafiq's shoulder, drawing blood. But Rafiq did not falter. With a single, decisive strike, he knocked the dagger from Malik's grip, sending it skittering across the floor. Malik fell to his knees, his breath heavy, his power slipping from his grasp. He looked up at Rafiq, his eyes burning with defiance. "Kill me then," he spat. "But know this, power is a poison. It will consume you just as it did me." Rafiq stared down at the man who had destroyed his family, who had stolen the throne, who had brought the kingdom to the edge of ruin. Then he lowered his sword. "No," he said. "Death is too easy for you." At his signal, the rebel guards stormed into the chamber. They seized Malik, forcing him to his feet. "For your crimes against the kingdom," Rafiq declared, his voice echoing through the halls, "you will stand trial before the people you sought to betray." Malik's face twisted in rage. "You think they will spare me?" Rafiq's expression remained cold. "No, but they will be the ones to decide." As the guards dragged Malik away, the Sultan looked at his son with something that had been missing for years: pride. "The throne is yours, Rafiq," he said. But the prince shook his head. "Not yet." He turned toward the balcony, where the sounds of battle were fading into the night. The people of the kingdom stood outside, watching, waiting. They did not need another ruler forced upon them. They needed a leader they could choose. And Rafiq would ensure they had that choice. The dawn that followed was unlike any the kingdom had seen in decades. The fires had burned out, leaving the scent of ash in the streets. The battle was over, but the wounds it left behind would take time to heal. The people stood outside the palace, thousands gathered in the square, waiting. They had fought for their freedom. Now, they wanted to see what came next. Rafiq stepped onto the grand balcony overlooking the city. His white robes were stained with blood, his shoulders still bandaged from the duel with Malik. But his voice, when he spoke, was strong. "The rule of fear is over." A murmur swept through the crowd. Some still looked uncertain, as if afraid to believe in hope after so many years of tyranny. He held up the stolen documents, the very proof of Malik's betrayal. The council thought they could rule from the shadows, twisting the will of the Sultan. They thought they could steal your voices, your future. But no longer. A roar of approval rose from the people. In the past, Rafik would have expected his father, the Sultan, to step forward and take control. But Sultan Khalid remained seated behind him, watching in silence. Rafik turned to face him. "The kingdom is yours again, father." The Sultan's expression was unreadable. "Is it?" he murmured. "Or have the people already chosen their ruler?" Rafik hesitated. "You are still the rightful Sultan." His father let out a tired breath. "Perhaps once. But power is not a crown, Rafik. It is a burden. One I have carried for too long." He gestured to the city. "And one you have already lifted." For the first time, Rafik understood. His father had spent years trapped between duty and manipulation. He had been a ruler, yes, but never truly free. And now, he was offering Rafik the chance to be something different. A ruler chosen by the people, not forced upon them. But Rafik knew he could not make the same mistakes as those before him. He turned back to the crowd. "For too long, this kingdom has been ruled by those who think power belongs to the few. But power belongs to you." His voice rang across the square. "No more councils ruling from the shadows. No more tyrants whispering lies. From this day forward, the kingdom will not be ruled by fear, but by justice." The people erupted into cheers. Gibran stepped forward, placing a hand on Rafik's shoulder. "You have done what many before you could not." His eyes shone with something like pride. "You have given the people back their voices." Amira, standing beside him, smirked. "And you haven't even sat on the throne yet." Rafik exhaled, a tired but genuine smile crossing his face. Maybe he never would. Maybe he would rewrite the very idea of what it meant to rule. Either way, the kingdom had been reborn. And this was only the beginning. The kingdom had won its freedom, but the battle for its future had only just begun. With Malik and the corrupt council removed from power, the city stood on the edge of a new era. The people had fought for change, but what came next would define whether their sacrifice had been worth it. Rafik knew this better than anyone. 4 days after the rebellion, the palace was filled with voices, some demanding justice, others seeking revenge. The trial of Malik and the council members became the center of attention. The people wanted to see their oppressors pay. "Execution is too merciful," one elder from the marketplace had said. "They should suffer as we did." "We must be better than them," Rafik had responded. The decision was made. Malik and his conspirators were stripped of their titles and wealth, sentenced to exile beyond the borders of the kingdom. Some called it too lenient. Others saw it as a sign of a ruler who would not let vengeance poison his rule. The people were watching, and Rafik had no intention of letting them down. The next challenge was even greater, reshaping the very foundation of the kingdom. Rafik refused to rule as the sultans before him had. He refused to let power sit in the hands of a few while the people suffered. Instead, he called for the creation of a new council, not of nobles, but of scholars, merchants, and leaders from all walks of life. For the first time in history, the people would have a voice in their own governance. It was not an easy transition. Many opposed the idea, fearing instability. But with Amira's sharp mind guiding reforms and Gibran ensuring the loyalty of the army, Rafik held firm. One evening, as they walked through the gardens of the palace, Amira smirked. "You do realize you're making history?" Rafik chuckled. "I suppose I am." She tilted her head. "And what of the future? What kind of ruler do you wish to be?" He looked out at the city, the golden rooftops glowing in the light of the setting sun. "Not a ruler," he said finally. "A servant of the people." Amira studied him for a long moment before smiling. "Then perhaps the kingdom has finally found the leader it deserves." Years passed, and the kingdom flourished. Trade routes reopened. Corruption faded. The people, for the first time in generations, thrived under a system built on justice rather than fear. Rafik's name became legend, not as a conqueror, but as the sultan who chose to share his power. His rule was marked not by war, but by wisdom. And in the years to come, when history spoke of him, it did not call him Sultan Rafik. It called him Rafik the Just, the man who had rebuilt a kingdom from the ashes of betrayal and left behind a legacy that would endure for generations. As he stood on the balcony one last time, looking over the city he had fought so hard to save, he knew one truth above all else. Power was never meant to be hoarded. It was meant to be given back. And so, with the dawn of a new day, he stepped away from the throne, choosing, as he always had, to walk among his people instead.